They say blood is thicker than water. Society conditions us to believe that our family of origin is our ultimate safety net, the people who will catch us when we fall, the ones who will love us unconditionally. But what happens when the very people who are supposed to protect you are the ones slowly draining the life out of you? What happens when you realize that to your own parents, you are not a daughter, but a resource to be exploited? My name is Corisenda Dalrymple. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. I am 32 years old and I work as a pediatric nurse. Every day, I hold the hands of frightened children, administer medications, and reassure anxious parents. I pour every ounce of warmth and empathy I have into my patients, perhaps because I spend my entire life trying to make up for the profound, echoing emptiness of my own childhood. To understand the bitter legal war that tore my family to shreds, you have to understand the house I grew up in. Oberon and Jessamine Dalrymple, my parents, were masters of the illusion. To the outside world, they were the picture of upper middle class perfection. My father was a man who wore expensive tailored suits, carried a leather briefcase, and spoke with the measured, patronizing tone of someone who believed he was always the smartest person in the room. My mother was a socialite in her own mind, constantly hosting charity luncheons, obsessing over the landscaping of our sprawling estate, and curating an image of flawless domestic bliss. But behind closed doors, the temperature in that house was freezing. The Dalrymple household operated on a very strict, unspoken hierarchy, and at the absolute top of that pyramid sat my older brother, Nathaniel. 3 years my senior, Nathaniel was the golden child. He was handsome, charismatic, and completely, utterly reckless. From the moment he could walk, my parents treated him as though he were the second coming. Every minor achievement of his was celebrated with lavish dinners. Every failure was immediately excused as someone else's fault. When he failed a class, the teacher was incompetent. When he got cut from the lacrosse team, the coach was biased. And then there was me, the scapegoat, the invisible girl. If Nathaniel was the sun my parents revolved around, I was the shadow they actively tried to ignore. My existence felt like an inconvenience to them. I learned very early on that taking up space in my own home would only result in cold sighs and irritated glances. I became fiercely independent not out of natural ambition, but out of sheer survival. I learned to cook my own meals by the time I was 9. I washed my own uniforms, signed my own permission slips, and spent most of my time hidden away in my bedroom, reading or studying. I remember the day I received my acceptance letter to a prestigious summer medical program when I was 15. I had spent months preparing the essay. I ran downstairs clutching the letter, a rare spark of hope blooming in my chest that maybe, just this once, they would look at me with pride. I found my parents in the kitchen. I held out the paper. My mother glanced at it, barely pausing as she poured her coffee. "That's nice, dear," she said flatly, "but please keep your voice down. Nathaniel has a terrible migraine. He was out late last night celebrating his new car. They had bought him a brand new BMW for his 18th birthday the night before. 3 weeks later, he would crash it into a light pole while driving intoxicated. My parents didn't ground him. Instead, my father hired a high-priced attorney to ensure the DUI was quietly scrubbed from his record, and my mother bought him a sleek new SUV to help him overcome the trauma of the accident." That was the dynamic. Nathaniel took, and my parents gave. But the well of their resources was not infinite, and eventually their blind devotion to my brother would cost me everything I had built. The breaking point arrived the year I turned 17. I knew my parents would not pay for my college education. They had made a passing comment years prior that nursing was a blue-collar job and not something they intended to finance. So I took matters into my own hands. For 3 years, I worked 2 jobs. I spent my afternoons after high school working the cash register at a local pharmacy and my weekends waiting tables at a busy diner downtown. I saved every single dollar, every tip, every holiday bonus. I wore thrifted clothes, skipped school dances, and ate instant noodles so I could build my escape fund. By the spring of my junior year, I had saved exactly $18,450. It was enough to cover my nursing school prerequisites, my certification exams, and a deposit on a cheap apartment. Because I was a minor, the savings account had to have a parent's name attached to it. My mother was the co-signer. I trusted that, if nothing else, they would leave my hard-earned money alone. I was foolish. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I went to the bank to deposit my latest paycheck. I handed the teller my little blue book, smiling proudly as I anticipated seeing the balance cross the $18,500 mark. The teller, a kind woman who knew me by name, frowned at her screen. She typed something again, her brow furrowing. "Honey," she said softly, looking up at me with profound pity in her eyes. "There's only $12.50 in this account." The floor dropped out from under me. I couldn't breathe. The air in the bank suddenly felt thick and suffocating. That's impossible," I stammered, gripping the edge of the counter. "I just checked the balance last week. There should be over $18,000. She turned the monitor slightly. "A withdrawal was made 3 days ago. An in-person withdrawal by the joint account holder, Jessamine Dalrymple. The funds were transferred to another account." I didn't walk home in the rain. I ran. My lungs burned, tears mixing with the cold downpour on my face. My mind raced with panic, denial, and a rising, white-hot fury. I burst through the heavy mahogany doors of our house, leaving wet footprints across the pristine hardwood floors. I found them in the sitting room. My mother was casually flipping through a catalog while my father typed on his laptop. They looked up, annoyed by my sudden, dripping entrance. "Where is it?" I demanded, my voice trembling so violently I barely recognized it. "Where is my money?" My mother slowly closed the catalog, completely unbothered. She took a delicate sip of her tea. "Don't be dramatic. We had a family emergency. We needed liquid cash immediately." "A family emergency?" I screamed, stepping forward. "That was my college fund. I worked 3 years for that. I worked until my feet bled. What emergency?" My father closed his laptop with a sharp snap. "Lower your voice when you speak to your mother," he commanded coldly. Nathaniel made some poor choices with his startup. He owed a significant amount of money to some very unsavory investors. If we hadn't paid them off, he could have faced legal trouble. You are his sister. Family helps family. I stared at them. They weren't sorry. There was no guilt in my mother's eyes, no remorse in my father's posture. They had stolen my future, my blood, sweat, and tears to bail out their golden child for the 100th time, and they expected me to simply absorb the blow. "Family helps family?" I whispered, the rage suddenly crystallizing into something cold and sharp. "You didn't borrow it. You stole it. You stole my life to fund his mistakes. You've never been a family to me. I've just been a prop in this house. You are a child living under our roof, eating our food," my mother snapped, her polite mask finally slipping to reveal the venom underneath. "Everything you have belongs to us. Nathaniel's future was at stake. You can always work a few more shifts at that greasy diner. Nursing school isn't going anywhere." At that exact moment, something inside me died, but something else, something unbreakable, was born. I didn't yell anymore. I didn't cry. The tears stopped completely. I looked at the 2 strangers sitting on the velvet sofa, and I saw them with absolute terrifying clarity. They would drain me dry to keep Nathaniel warm, and they would sleep soundly doing it. "I'm leaving," I said quietly. "Oh, please," my father scoffed, opening his laptop again. "Go to your room. You're acting like a hysterical child." I didn't go to my room to pout. I went to my room, pulled a duffel bag from the closet, and packed only what I could carry. I packed my clothes, my books, and the few mementos that actually mattered to me. I walked down the stairs out the front door and stepped into the rain. I never spent another night in that house. The next few years were a blur of grueling exhaustion and relentless determination. I initiated the legal process of emancipation. I rented a tiny, drafty room in the basement of a kindly older woman's house. I worked graveyard shifts at a hospital as an orderly, cleaning bedpans and mopping floors while going to community college during the day. I was chronically sleep-deprived, malnourished, and running entirely on spite and willpower. But I did it. I earned my nursing degree. I passed my boards on the first try. I became an independent, self-sufficient woman without a single dime or a single word of encouragement from the people who brought me into this world. But I was not entirely alone. While my parents and my brother had written me off as a rebellious failure who would eventually come crawling back, begging for scraps, there was one person in the Dalrymple family who saw the truth, one person who recognized my worth, Harrison Dalrymple, my grandfather. Grandpa Harrison was my father's father, the true patriarch of the family and the source of the wealth my parents loved to flaunt. Unlike my father, who was arrogant and hollow, my grandfather was a man of profound integrity. He had built his real estate empire from nothing, relying on grit and honesty. By the time I left home, he was in his late 70s, living quietly in a modest, sunlit house on the outskirts of Boston, preferring his garden and his books to the loud, ostentatious lifestyle my parents desperately clung to. He knew exactly what Auberon and Jessamine were. He saw right through their facade, and he saw right through Nathaniel's charm. A week after I left my parents' house at 17, I received a handwritten letter at my new basement apartment. It contained a single key and a short note. "The door is always open. Sunday tea is at 3 p.m. I'm proud of you." From that Sunday on, for the next 15 years, my grandfather's house became my secret haven. I never told my parents we were in contact. They rarely visited him anyway, finding him boring and too critical of their spending habits. Every Sunday, I would sit on his worn leather sofa, drinking Earl Grey tea, and we would talk. I told him about my grueling night shifts, my difficult patients, my exams. He would listen with genuine interest, his sharp blue eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. He was the one who bought me my first real stethoscope when I graduated. He was the one who pinned my name badge to my scrubs. He offered to pay for my schooling countless times. He offered to buy me an apartment, a car to make my life easier. But I always politely, firmly refused. "I love you, Grandpa," I told him one afternoon, gently pushing an envelope of cash back across the coffee table. "But I need to do this myself. If I take your money, I'm no different than Nathaniel. I want you for your time, your stories, and your company, not your bank account." He looked at me for a long time that day, a mixture of sorrow and immense pride washing over his lined face. He placed his hand over mine. "You are the best of us," he whispered. "You are the only real thing in this entire family." For 15 years, we maintained our quiet routine. I built a fulfilling career, I found a chosen family of friends and colleagues, and I found a peace I never thought possible. My parents didn't call me. I didn't call them. The silence was a boundary that protected my sanity. But life has a cruel way of forcing you to confront the ghosts you thought you had buried. When Grandpa Harrison turned 85, his health began to fail rapidly. A series of minor strokes weakened him, stealing his mobility, but never his sharp, brilliant mind. As his condition deteriorated, the vultures began to circle. My parents, who hadn't spent more than 2 hours a year with him, suddenly began making highly publicized visits, snapping photos for social media to portray themselves as devoted caretakers. I knew the end was coming, and I knew that when his heart finally stopped beating, the fragile peace I had built would be shattered. I just had no idea how vicious, how dark, and how far my parents were willing to go when they discovered the final, earth-shattering secret Grandpa Harrison left behind. When you work in pediatric oncology and intensive care, you become intimately acquainted with the rhythm of fading life. You learn to read the subtle shifts in a patient's breathing, the slight changes in their skin tone, the way their pulse flutters like a tired moth against a window pane before finally coming to rest. Death, to me, was not a stranger. It was a quiet, inevitable companion that I had learned to treat with profound respect. But nothing. No amount of medical training, no years of clinical experience, no hardened professional exterior can truly prepare you for the moment that rhythm begins to slow in someone you love. When Grandpa Harrison's health took its final, steep decline, I didn't hesitate. I used every hour of accumulated paid time off and filed for the Family and Medical Leave Act. I packed a small suitcase and temporarily moved into the guest bedroom of his quiet, sunlit home on the outskirts of the city. I was not going to let him spend his final weeks surrounded by sterile hospital walls and beeping monitors. And more importantly, I was not going to leave him vulnerable to the sudden, suffocating presence of my parents. Oberon and Jessamine's reaction to my grandfather's terminal prognosis was exactly what I had expected. A masterclass in performative grief. For 15 years, they had barely managed a phone call on his birthday. But the moment the doctors mentioned hospice care, my parents descended upon his house like actors arriving on a movie set. They didn't come to help. They never once emptied a bedside commode, never adjusted his pillows to prevent bed sores, never sat up at 3 a.m. holding his hand when the pain medication wore off. Instead, their visits were carefully choreographed events. My mother would sweep into the house in immaculate, subdued designer clothing, her perfume overpowering the faint, sterile smell of the medical supplies I had meticulously organized. She would bring extravagant, useless flower arrangements that my grandfather, with his failing lungs, was highly allergic to. My father would stand at the foot of the bed, checking his gold watch, speaking to his own father in the loud, overly enunciated voice one might use with a confused tourist. "We're keeping everyone updated, Dad," Oberon would boom, patting the edge of the mattress, careful not to wrinkle his suit jacket. "The country club has been sending their regards. We told them you're fighting hard." Then came the photographs. It was grotesque. Jessamine would lean in, her perfectly manicured hand resting lightly on his frail shoulder, and instruct my father to take a picture with her smartphone. "Just one for the church prayer group," she would coo, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Smile a little, Harrison. Show them you're being strong. My grandfather, exhausted and rapidly losing his vision, would barely register the flash. The moment the photo was taken, my mother would step back, instantly dropping the devoted daughter-in-law routine, and begin furiously typing on her screen to post it online. They would stay for exactly 20 minutes, just long enough to establish an alibi of filial piety, before rushing off to a dinner reservation or a networking event. Nathaniel, true to form, only visited twice. The first time, he spent the entire 30 minutes complaining about a failed cryptocurrency investment, hoping his dying grandfather might offer to bail him out one last time. When Harrison remained silent, Nathaniel simply checked his phone, muttered an excuse about a meeting, and left. I bore their visits in silence, standing in the corner of the room, my arms crossed, watching the grotesque theater unfold. I didn't yell. I didn't kick them out. I knew they weren't there for him. They were there for the inheritance they believed was coming. They were playing the final act of a long, greedy game. Once they were gone, the house would return to its peaceful quiet. I would open the windows to let out my mother's perfume, brew a pot of chamomile tea, and sit in the armchair beside his bed. Those quiet hours were some of the most profound of my life. As a nurse, I took over his complete medical management. I charted his vitals, managed his morphine drip to ensure he was never in pain, and read to him from his favorite historical biographies when he was too tired to speak. On a rainy Thursday evening, exactly 3 weeks after I had moved in, the atmosphere in the room changed. The air felt thin. His breathing had taken on the shallow, irregular pattern that I knew all too well. I set down the book I was reading and moved to the edge of his bed, taking his frail, paper-thin hand in both of mine. His eyes, clouded but still retaining a spark of that sharp blue intelligence, slowly opened and focused on my face. He didn't look afraid. He looked incredibly tired and incredibly peaceful. "You've been a good girl," he whispered, his voice barely a rasp against the silence of the room. Tears, hot and sudden, spilled over my eyelashes and tracked down my cheeks. "I love you, Grandpa," I choked out, pressing his hand to my forehead. "It's okay. You can rest now. I'm right here." He squeezed my fingers with a strength that surprised me. "I took care of it," he murmured, his breath catching. "Everything. Don't let them bully you. You stand your ground." I didn't fully understand what he meant at that moment. I thought he was just giving me general life advice, a final reminder to stay strong against my parents' emotional abuse. I nodded, stroking his white hair. "I will. I promise." 10 minutes later, with the rain softly tapping against the window pane, Harrison Dalrymple took his final breath. He passed away exactly as he had lived, quietly, with dignity, and surrounded by genuine love. The funeral was a spectacular display of hypocrisy. Jessamine wore a sweeping black dress and a veil, weeping theatrically into a lace handkerchief whenever someone from their social circle approached. Oberon stood by the casket, shaking hands with a stoic, mournful expression, accepting condolences as if he had just lost his best friend. Nathaniel hovered near the open bar at the reception, looking bored. I stood in the back of the church wearing a simple black suit entirely unnoticed. My parents didn't ask me to sit in the front row with the family. They didn't include my name in the printed obituary under the list of grieving relatives. To the hundreds of people gathered there, Oberon, Jessamine, and Nathaniel were the heartbroken survivors. I was just a ghost in the back pew. But I didn't care. I knew the truth. I knew who was holding his hand when he crossed over, and that was the only thing that mattered. 2 weeks after the funeral, the illusion finally shattered. The summons came in the form of a heavy, cream-colored envelope from the law offices of Gregory and Associates, the firm that had managed my grandfather's estate for over 40 years. The letter requested the presence of Oberon, Jessamine, Nathaniel, and myself for the formal reading of the last will and testament. When I arrived at the polished, mahogany-paneled conference room in downtown Boston, my family was already there. Oberon was sitting at the head of the table, looking incredibly relaxed, sipping a sparkling water. Jessamine was flipping through a magazine, and Nathaniel was leaning back in his leather chair, tapping a pen against his phone screen. When I walked in, my mother looked up, her expression instantly souring into a scowl of deep irritation. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, not even bothering to lower her voice. I pulled out a chair at the opposite end of the long table, setting my purse on the floor. I was invited, by the attorney. Oberon let out a short, patronizing laugh. "Well, it's standard procedure to invite all immediate blood relatives, I suppose. A formality. Don't get your hopes up. My father was a traditionalist. He believed in keeping the estate intact through the primary male heir. He gestured loosely to himself and then to Nathaniel. I'm not here for a handout, I said coldly, leaning back in my chair and meeting his gaze without flinching. I'm here because Grandpa asked me to be. Before Oberon could fire back another insult, the heavy wooden door opened and Thomas Gregory entered. He was a distinguished silver-haired attorney in his late 60s, a man who had known my grandfather personally for decades. He carried a thick leather folder, his expression grave and entirely unreadable. He took his seat at the center of the table, adjusting his reading glasses. He nodded briefly to my parents, and then his eyes found mine. He offered me a small, respectful smile, a subtle acknowledgement of the weeks I had spent caring for his old friend. My father noticed the exchange, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. Thank you all for coming, Mr. Gregory began, his voice deep and authoritative. We are here to execute the final wishes of Harrison Dalrymple. As his sole executor, it is my duty to ensure his instructions are carried out precisely as he dictated them in his final amended will, dated exactly 3 months prior to his passing. My father sat up a little straighter, adjusting his silk tie. Of course, Thomas. Let's get through the legal jargon. Nathaniel has a flight to catch this afternoon. Mr. Gregory looked at my father over the rim of his glasses, his expression chilling slightly. I suggest you cancel the flight, Nathaniel. This requires everyone's full attention. He opened the leather folder and withdrew a crisp, sealed document. The room fell dead silent. Even my mother stopped flipping her magazine. I, Harrison Elias Dalrymple, Mr. Gregory read, his voice filling the quiet room, being of sound mind and memory, do hereby declare this document to be my last will and testament, revoking all prior wills and codicils. He read through the standard preliminary clauses, the payment of debts, the funeral arrangements. Oberon tapped his fingers impatiently on the mahogany table. Now, regarding the distribution of my assets, Mr. Gregory continued, turning the page, to my son, Oberon Dalrymple, and my daughter-in-law, Jessamine Dalrymple. My parents leaned forward collectively, practically salivating. I leave the sum of $1 each. The silence that followed was so absolute, so profound, it felt as though the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the room. My father's hand froze mid-tap. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. My mother's jaw dropped slightly, her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly looking garish against her pale skin. I'm sorry, Oberon said, his voice cracking, a nervous, breathless laugh escaping his throat. I think I misheard you, Thomas. $1? You heard correctly, Oberon, Mr. Gregory said smoothly, his eyes fixed firmly on the document. Furthermore, the will states, I make this specific, nominal bequest to my son and daughter-in-law not out of malice, but out of a clear and calculated understanding of their character. They have received ample financial support from me throughout their lives, funds which have been routinely squandered to maintain a facade of wealth. They require no further assistance from my estate. This is a joke, Nathaniel blurted out, sitting up straight, his phone clattering to the table. What about me? I'm the only grandson. Mr. Gregory didn't even blink. He continued reading. To my grandson, Nathaniel Dalrymple, I leave nothing. It is my sincere hope that the absence of my financial safety net will finally force him to develop the work ethic and personal accountability he so desperately lacks. That's a lie! Jessamine shrieked, suddenly leaping to her feet, her chair violently scraping against the hardwood floor. He would never write that. He loved Nathaniel. He was proud of him. Mrs. Dalrymple, please sit down, Mr. Gregory warned, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. This document was drafted under my direct supervision, notarized, and witnessed by independent parties. I assure you, these are his exact words. Then who gets it? Oberon demanded, his voice rising in panic, the polished veneer completely stripped away to reveal the desperate, greedy man underneath. The accounts, the investment portfolios, the commercial real estate. Who gets it? Some charity? Some dog rescue? Mr. Gregory slowly turned the final page. He looked directly at me. To my granddaughter, Corisanda Dalrymple, he read, his voice softening just a fraction, who is the only member of this family to show me genuine affection without expectation of reward. The girl who built her life with her own 2 hands, who possesses the integrity and compassion this family has long lacked. I leave the entirety of my remaining estate. My heart stopped. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to process the words. This includes all liquid assets currently valued at approximately $18.5 million, Mr. Gregory stated calmly, as well as all commercial holdings, investment portfolios, and physical properties. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then, the explosion happened. "You little bitch!" Jessamine screamed, lunging forward, her hands slamming flat onto the conference table. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You planned this! You wormed your way into his house when he was dying, you pumped him full of those drugs you steal from your hospital, and you forced him to sign this. Jessamine, control yourself, or I will have security remove you," Mr. Gregory barked, standing up. "She manipulated him," Oberon yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "He had dementia. He didn't know what he was doing. We will contest this. We will tie this up in probate court for the next 20 years, I swear to God." I didn't shrink back. I didn't cry. For the first time in 32 years, I looked at my parents' rage, and I felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no intimidation, just a cold clinical observation of their pathetic unraveling. "He didn't have dementia, Oberon," I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through their hysteria like a scalpel. "His cognitive function was perfectly intact. I have the medical charts to prove it." "You arrogant little leech," my mother spat, tears of pure fury streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. "You think you've won? You think you can just take our family's legacy? The money is one thing, but you won't touch our lives. The investment's fine, but the house is ours. The Oak Ridge estate belongs to us." Mr. Gregory, who had been organizing the paperwork, suddenly paused. He looked at my mother with an expression that bordered on genuine pity. "Mrs. Dalrymple," he said slowly, choosing his words with deliberate, devastating precision, "I think you need to review your own financial records. Oberon, did you never explain the deed arrangement to your wife?" My father froze. The aggressive, threatening posture melted away, replaced by a look of sudden, profound terror. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting wildly. "What deed arrangement?" Jessamine demanded, whipping her head to look at her husband. "Oberon, what is he talking about?" Mr. Gregory sighed heavily. "The Oak Ridge estate, the 6-bedroom mansion you have resided in for the past 25 years, was purchased by Harrison Dalrymple. Oberon, your father allowed you to live there rent-free, paying only the property taxes, but he never transferred the deed to your name. He retained sole legal ownership of the property." My mother stumbled backward, hitting the edge of her chair. No, that's impossible. It's our house. I decorated it. I hosted the governor there." "Legally, it was Harrison's house," Mr. Gregory clarified, his tone utterly devoid of sympathy. He turned his gaze back to me, the implications of his next words hanging heavy in the air. "And as of the execution of this will, the Oak Ridge estate, along with everything inside it, now belongs entirely to Corisande." The silence returned, but this time it was suffocating. Nathaniel looked like he was going to be sick. Jessamine was staring at Oberon, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, realizing the horrific truth. The wealthy, elite lifestyle she had bragged about for decades was built on borrowed ground. I looked at my father, the man who had mocked my nursing career, who had stolen my college fund, who had told me I was nothing but a burden. "So," I said quietly, the word dropping into the silence like a stone into a deep well, "it seems I am your landlord." Oberon's face contorted. "Corisande, be reasonable. I wouldn't what?" I interrupted, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I wouldn't throw you out into the street. I wouldn't take everything you rely on to survive. I wouldn't leave you with absolutely nothing." I tilted my head, studying him with the clinical detachment of a nurse examining a terminal disease. "Why wouldn't I? After all, family helps family, right?" My father had no answer. They didn't just lose an inheritance that day in the mahogany conference room, they lost their leverage, they lost their power. But as I watched my mother's shock curdle into a desperate feral panic, I knew this wasn't the end. The battle hadn't been won, it had only just been declared. Cornered animals are the most dangerous kind, and my parents, suddenly faced with the prospect of losing their precious mansion and their wealthy facade, were about to show me exactly how far they were willing to go to destroy me. The silence that followed the reading of my grandfather's will did not last long. It was merely the receding of the tide before a devastating tsunami. When you strip a narcissist of their power, their immediate reaction is never self-reflection. It is annihilation. Oberon and Jessamine Dalrymple had spent their entire adult lives meticulously crafting an image of generational wealth and unshakable status. To lose the Oak Ridge estate, to be exposed as financial frauds living on the charity of a man they routinely ignored, was a fate worse than death to them. But more importantly, to lose it all to me, the daughter they had actively discarded, was an insult their fragile egos could not process. They couldn't just challenge the will on standard legal grounds. Thomas Gregory had made sure the document was ironclad. My grandfather's medical records from his primary care physician, updated regularly until his passing, proved he was of sound mind. So, my parents had to find another way to break me. They had to destroy my credibility, isolate me from my support system, and apply so much agonizing pressure that I would voluntarily surrender the inheritance just to make the pain stop. The psychological warfare began subtly. 3 days after the meeting in Mr. Gregory's office, my phone started ringing. Unrecognized numbers, mostly. Then came the text messages from extended family members, aunts, uncles, and second cousins I hadn't spoken to in a decade. How could you do this to your mother? She is grieving. Oberon told us what happened. You should be ashamed of yourself taking advantage of an old man. We always knew you were troubled, Corisanda, but this is a new low. I blocked the numbers one by one, sitting alone in my small apartment, my chest tight with a familiar, suffocating anxiety. They were weaponizing the family against me, spinning a narrative where I was the predatory villain who had swooped in during Harrison's final days to manipulate a fortune away from his loving, devoted son. Then, the campaign moved from private whispers to public humiliation. Oberon still had connections in the local media from his days of throwing lavish charity galas. A week later, an article appeared in a prominent Boston Society blog. The headline read, "Prominent local family torn apart by caretaker granddaughter's greed." The article didn't use my full name. It referred to me as C. Dalrymple, but the details were unmistakable. It painted a picture of a troubled, estranged young woman who had abandoned her family years ago, only to reappear when the patriarch was on his deathbed, isolating him from his beloved son and daughter-in-law to rewrite his estate plans. The article spread. It was shared on Facebook, whispered about in the country clubs, and inevitably it breached the walls of my sanctuary, the hospital. I walked into the pediatric intensive care unit for my morning shift, expecting the usual chaotic symphony of monitors and hushed voices. Instead, I felt eyes on me. Nurses I had worked alongside for years suddenly stopped talking when I approached the nurses' station. The unit coordinator avoided my gaze when handing me my patient charts. At lunch, I found the charge nurse, a stern but fair woman named Margaret, waiting for me in the break room. She had a printed copy of the blog post on the table. "Corisande," she said gently, but with a firm undercurrent of concern. "Is this about you?" I looked at the paper, my stomach dropping into my shoes. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. "Yes," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But it's a lie, Margaret. It's entirely fabricated by my parents. They were written out of my grandfather's will, and they're retaliating." Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples. "I believe you. You're one of the most compassionate nurses on this floor. But this is a PR nightmare, honey. The hospital administration hates scandal. Parents of our patients might see this. You need to get this handled, quickly." I nodded numbly, retreating to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, the dark circles under my eyes, the pale, drawn skin. I was exhausted. I was grieving the only man who had ever loved me, and now I was fighting a war on two fronts. But as horrific as the gossip was, it was only the opening salvo. The true, devastating blow arrived 2 days later via certified mail. I had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift. My feet ached and my mind was foggy. I unlocked my apartment door and found the thick manila envelope resting on my welcome mat. The return address made my blood run instantly cold. The State Board of Registration in Nursing. My hands shook so violently I could barely tear the flap open. I pulled out a stack of official, watermarked documents. As my eyes scanned the bold, dense legal text, the world around me seemed to tilt on its axis. It was a formal notice of investigation. An anonymous complaint, though I knew exactly who had filed it, had been lodged against my nursing license. The allegations were horrifying. The complaint accused me of gross professional misconduct, elder abuse, and the unauthorized diversion of Schedule II narcotics. Specifically, My parents were alleging that I had used my position as a registered nurse to steal liquid Ativan and morphine from the hospital, taking the drugs to my grandfather's house to chemically restrain and cognitively impair him during his final months. They claimed I kept him in a drug-induced stupor to coerce him into signing the amended will, preventing him from contacting his son. I dropped the papers. They fluttered to the hardwood floor like dead leaves. My knees gave out and I sank to the ground, my back pressed against the front door. I couldn't breathe. A high-pitched ringing echoed in my ears. This wasn't just about the $18 million anymore. This wasn't about the Oak Ridge estate. This was a calculated, lethal strike aimed directly at my soul. Being a pediatric nurse wasn't just my job. It was my entire identity. It was the way I put good into a world that had shown me so much cruelty. To be accused of using my medical knowledge to torture and manipulate the grandfather I adored, it was a level of evil I couldn't even comprehend. If the nursing board found even a shred of probable cause, my license would be suspended pending a full hearing. I would be fired. My career would be over. I would be a pariah in the medical community. An hour later, as I sat paralyzed on the floor, an email chimed on my phone. It was from Arthur Sterling, a high-powered, ruthless litigation attorney my father had retained. The subject line read, "Without prejudice, settlement offer regarding the estate of Harrison Dalrymple." The email was wrapped in polite, sanitized legalese, but the extortion was crystal clear. Sterling stated that his clients, Auberon and Jessamine, were deeply distressed by the circumstances surrounding Harrison's final days, and were fully prepared to challenge the will in probate court while simultaneously cooperating with any and all state regulatory investigations. However, the email continued, out of a desire to spare the family further public embarrassment, they were willing to offer a generous compromise. If I agreed to forfeit the Oak Ridge estate back to Oberon and split the liquid assets 50-50, they would drop the probate challenge. And implicitly, the anonymous nursing board complaint would magically disappear. Blackmail. Pure, unadulterated blackmail. Give us the money and the mansion, or we will destroy your life, your reputation, and your ability to ever practice medicine again. I pulled my knees to my chest, burying my face in my hands, and I sobbed. I wept with the broken, gasping breaths of the scared 17-year-old girl who had run out into the rain all those years ago. They had won. They had found the one pressure point that could break me. The money meant nothing to me. I would gladly burn the $18 million if it meant keeping my nursing license and my grandfather's memory pure. Just sign it. A tired, defeated voice whispered in my mind. Just give them the damn house and the money. Let them have it. Buy your peace. You can't fight them. They have endless resources and zero morals. You are just one exhausted nurse. I wiped my eyes, reaching for my bag to pull out my laptop. I was going to reply to Arthur Sterling. I was going to surrender. But as I pulled my bag toward me, my hospital lanyard spilled out onto the floor. The plastic ID badge clattered against the wood. I stared at it. Right above my name, Corisanda Dalrymple, BSN, RN, was a small enamel daisy pin. Grandpa Harrison had given it to me the day I passed my licensing boards. We had celebrated with tea and lemon cake in his garden. He had pinned it to my lanyard himself, his hands shaking slightly with age, his blue eyes bright with tears of pride. The daisy is a resilient flower, Corisanda, he had told me that afternoon. It grows in harsh conditions. It survives the frost, and no matter how hard you trample it, it finds a way to stand back up and face the sun. You wear this, and you remember who you are. I closed my eyes, and the memory of his final moments in the hospice bed washed over me. Don't let them bully you. You stand your ground. He knew. Even in his dying days, he knew exactly what they would try to do to me. He hadn't left me the estate just to make me rich. He had left it to me to finally balance the scales. He had handed me the sword, and now I was thinking about dropping it just because the dragons roared. If I surrendered, I wasn't buying peace. I was validating their abuse. I was telling them that they could steal my college fund, erase my childhood, desecrate my grandfather's memory, and threaten my career, and I would still bow to them. If I signed that settlement, I would never be able to look at myself in the mirror again. I picked up the daisy pin. I closed my fist around it tightly, feeling the sharp metal edges bite into my palm. The tears stopped. The paralyzing fear evaporated, replaced by a slow, burning, righteous fury. I was not going to surrender. I was going to war. But I couldn't fight monsters with kindness. I needed a monster of my own. I spent the entire night researching. I didn't want a polite estate planner like Thomas Gregory. I needed a litigator. I needed someone who specialized in high conflict probate litigation, someone who looked at Arthur Sterling and saw prey. At 8 a.m. the next morning, I walked into the sleek, glass-walled offices of Vance & Associates in downtown Boston. Evelyn Vance was a legend in the Massachusetts legal circuit. She was in her late 40s, sharp-featured, dressed in an immaculate charcoal pantsuit, and possessed a gaze so penetrating it felt like she was reading my x-rays. She did not deal in pleasantries. I sat across from her massive mahogany desk and placed the nursing board complaint, Arthur Sterling's extortion email, and a copy of my grandfather's will down in front of her. My parents are trying to blackmail me into surrendering an $18 million estate by framing me for elder abuse and trying to strip my nursing license, I said, my voice steady, completely devoid of the panic I had felt the night before. I want to stop them. I want to crush them so thoroughly they never speak my name again. Can you help me? Evelyn Vance leaned forward, lacing her fingers together. She didn't look at the documents right away. She looked at me. She studied my posture, the dark circles under my eyes, and the hard, unyielding set of my jaw. Slowly, a sharp, dangerous smile spread across her face. Ms. Dalrymple, Evelyn purred, her voice smooth and lethal. I absolutely despise bullies. Let's see what you've brought me. For the next 2 hours, I laid out my entire life story. I told her about the stolen college fund, the 15 years of estrangement, the performative hospital visits, and the reality of my grandfather's decline. I explained how I had meticulously charted every single milligram of medication I had given him, utilizing an independent hospice agency to verify my counts. Evelyn read through Arthur Sterling's email twice. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the desk. Sterling is a shark, Evelyn noted, her eyes narrowing. But he's an arrogant shark. He sent this settlement offer way too quickly after the nursing board complaint was filed. He's trying to connect the two events without legally connecting them. It's a classic intimidation tactic. They are playing dirty, corisande, because they have absolutely no legal leg to stand on regarding the will itself. What do we do about the nursing board? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. If they suspend my license, they won't, Evelyn said firmly, holding up a hand. I am going to draft a response to the board today. We will provide your grandfather's complete hospice charts, signed off by the attending physician, proving your medication administration was flawless. We will also include a copy of the will and Sterling's settlement email, demonstrating clear, retaliatory bias by the complainants. The board deals with malicious reporting in family disputes more often than you think. Once they see the financial motive, the investigation will stall. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 3 days. But we aren't just going to play defense, Evelyn continued, her eyes flashing with a predatory light. Your parents want to drag this into the mud? Fine. We'll show them what mud really looks like. They filed a formal objection to the will in probate court claiming undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. That means we go to the discovery phase, and then we depose them. Depose them, I repeated. Evelyn nodded. We put them under oath on camera in a room with me. We force them to answer for every single allegation they've made. And if they lie under oath, which narcissists almost always do, we trap them. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. Arthur Sterling thinks you're a frightened, exhausted little nurse who will fold under the threat of losing her career. He expects me to call him and negotiate. Are you going to? I asked. Evelyn's smile returned, colder this time. No. I'm going to send him a single sentence declining his offer and a notice of deposition for Oberon and Jessamine Dalrymple. We are going to force them to step into the ring they built. I left Evelyn Vance's office that morning with a strange, unfamiliar sensation blooming in my chest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for my parents' next blow. I wasn't running away. I was standing my ground, just like Grandpa Harrison had asked. The fear was gone. The sorrow was pushed aside. As I walked out into the crisp Boston air, looking up at the towering skyscrapers, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. The legal battle would be brutal, invasive, and exhausting. But my parents had made a fatal miscalculation. They thought they were dealing with the invisible, compliant girl they had abused for 17 years. They were about to find out they were dealing with a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose, and an $18 million war chest to fight them with. The 3 weeks leading up to the depositions were a masterclass in preparation and emotional endurance. If my childhood had taught me how to survive a siege, Evelyn Vance was teaching me how to wage a war. My life became a blur of 12-hour shifts at the pediatric intensive care unit, followed by 4-hour strategy sessions in Evelyn's sleek, glass-walled conference room. We turned that room into a bunker. The massive mahogany table was entirely covered in neatly labeled binders, medical flow sheets, bank statements, and printed emails. Evelyn was not just an attorney. She was a tactician. She understood that my parents weren't just fighting for money. They were fighting for the preservation of their fabricated reality. Narcissists like Oberon and Jessamine operate on a very specific frequency, Evelyn explained one Tuesday evening, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston skyline. She held a cup of black coffee, her eyes scanning a whiteboard covered in timelines. They believe their own lies. They have to, or their egos would collapse. Because they believe their lies, they assume everyone else is stupid enough to believe them too. That arrogance is their greatest weakness. We aren't going to argue with them, Corisande. We are going to let them talk, let them spin their web on the legal record, and then we are going to drop an anvil of undeniable facts on it. Our first major victory came quietly, exactly 2 weeks after I had hired her. I was in the hospital break room staring blankly at a lukewarm cup of tea when my phone vibrated. It was an email from Evelyn. Attached was a formal letter from the State Board of Registration in Nursing. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the PDF. I read the first paragraph and a profound, trembling relief washed over me. The board had reviewed the comprehensive packet Evelyn had submitted, which included my grandfather's official hospice charts, signed off by his independent attending physician, alongside the extortion email from Arthur Sterling and a copy of the contested will. The investigation was officially closed due to insufficient evidence and overwhelming indicators of retaliatory bad faith reporting. The complaint was dismissed entirely. My license was safe. My career, the one pure thing I had built with my own 2 hands, would not be taken from me. I printed the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it inside my scrubs pocket right behind my daisy pin. It was my armor. They had fired their most lethal psychological weapon, and it had deflected off the truth. But I knew the battlefield was about to shift. With the nursing board threat neutralized, Oberon and Jessamine would be desperate. And desperate people do dangerous, unpredictable things. The formal depositions were scheduled for a rainy Thursday morning. We were to meet at the offices of Arthur Sterling. Unlike Evelyn's modern, streamlined firm, Sterling's office was designed to intimidate. It was a labyrinth of dark wood paneling, heavy velvet drapes, and walls lined with antique legal volumes that looked as though they had never been opened. It smelled of expensive cigars, leather polish, and old money. It was exactly the kind of place my father felt most powerful. Evelyn and I arrived 15 minutes early. I wore a tailored, slate gray suit. I had pulled my hair back into a tight, professional bun. I didn't want to look like the wounded daughter they remembered. I wanted to look like the formidable woman I had become. When Oberon and Jessamine entered the conference room, accompanied by Arthur Sterling, the air temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. My mother had dressed for a performance. She wore a high-necked, black silk blouse and a tasteful silver cross necklace, clutching a crumpled tissue in her manicured hand. Her eyes were expertly lined with a faint touch of red to simulate recent, heartbreaking tears. My father wore a navy pinstripe suit, his posture rigid with arrogant indignation. He didn't even look at me. Nathaniel was notably absent. He had likely found the legal proceedings too boring or too threatening to his fragile worldview. Arthur Sterling took his seat at the head of the table. He was a man in his late 50s with slicked back silver hair and the cold, dead eyes of a great white shark. Beside him sat a court reporter, her fingers hovering over her stenography machine, ready to capture every syllable. "Let's get this over with," Sterling said smoothly, opening a thick file. "Ms. Dalrymple, you understand you are under oath." "I do," I replied, my voice steady. Evelyn sat beside me, completely still, radiating a calm, lethal energy. Sterling didn't start softly. He went straight for the jugular, utilizing a rapid-fire questioning technique designed to disorient and confuse the witness. For the first hour, he grilled me on my grandfather's final months. He tried to paint a picture of an isolated, terrified old man being kept captive by a greedy, drug-pushing granddaughter. "Isn't it true, Ms. Dalrymple, that you restricted your parents' access to Harrison Dalrymple during his final 3 weeks?" Sterling asked, leaning forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "No, that is incorrect," I answered cleanly. "I managed his medical care schedule. Oberon and Jessamine Dalrymple visited a total of 4 times in 3 weeks. Their visits averaged 22 minutes each. I never once restricted their entry. Sterling frowned slightly, flipping a page. You are a registered nurse, are you not? I am. And you have access to highly potent narcotics at your hospital? Objection, Evelyn said smoothly, not raising her voice. Relevance, and assumes facts not in evidence regarding my client's access protocols. I'll rephrase, Sterling sneered. Did you or did you not administer liquid morphine and Ativan to Harrison Dalrymple on a daily basis? I administered medications precisely as prescribed by Dr. Eris Thorne, the independent palliative care physician. I replied, leaning into my professional persona. The clinical terminology was my shield. The dosages were titrated specifically to manage terminal dyspnea and breakthrough pain, standard protocols for end-stage congestive heart failure. Every milligram was documented in the hospice flow sheets, which have been provided to you in Discovery. Sterling was getting frustrated. He had expected a weeping, defensive girl. Instead, he was interviewing a highly trained medical professional who was giving him nothing but cold, indisputable data. Then, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Sterling glanced at my mother. Jessamine gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, dabbing her dry eyes with her tissue. Sterling reached into his briefcase. Ms. Dalrymple, your medical charts are very neat, but we both know that paper can hide a multitude of sins. Psychological coercion, for instance, doesn't leave a bruise. He pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside it was a small black moleskin notebook. Its cover was worn at the edges. My heart skipped a beat. I recognized that notebook. Grandpa Harrison used to keep one just like it on his nightstand to jot down gardening ideas and book recommendations before his hands became too weak to hold a pen. I am marking this as Exhibit D, Sterling stated for the record, sliding the bagged notebook across the mahogany table toward me. Ms. Dalrymple, do you recognize this? I looked down at it. It appears to be a notebook similar to one my grandfather owned. Not similar. It is his, Sterling corrected sharply. This was recovered from his bedside table by Jessamine Dalrymple the day after he passed away. It is his personal journal from his final weeks. Evelyn sat forward, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. Mr. Sterling, this piece of evidence was not included in your initial mandatory discovery disclosures. It was only recently located amidst Mrs. Dalrymple's profound grief, Evelyn, Sterling replied smoothly, though a hint of triumph danced in his eyes. He turned back to me. Ms. Dalrymple, I want you to read the entry marked with the yellow sticky note. Aloud, please. I looked at Evelyn. She gave me a curt, microscopic nod. Stay calm. Read it. I reached out with a slightly trembling hand and opened the notebook to the marked page. My eyes fell upon the blue ink. The handwriting was cursive, slanted slightly to the right. I began to read, my voice echoing in the silent, suffocating room. May 14th. I am so tired. The pain is unbearable today. Corisande is always here. She watches me constantly. I told her I wanted to see Oberon, to make things right with my boy before I go. She became very angry. She held up the syringe of my pain medicine. She told me she would inject me with poison, that she would stop my heart right now if I didn't sign the new papers the lawyer brought. I am so afraid. I just want my son. The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Oh, Harrison, Jessamine suddenly wailed, a horrific theatrical sob tearing from her throat. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving violently. My poor, sweet father-in-law, she tortured him. Oberon, she tortured him to steal our house. Oberon slammed his fist onto the table, his face purple with manufactured rage. You monster, he roared at me. You held a needle to my dying father's arm. You sick, twisted little... Quiet, Evelyn snapped, her voice cracking like a whip, silencing Oberon instantly. She turned a glare of absolute zero onto Arthur Sterling. This is an ambush, Arthur, and a poorly executed one at that. But I barely heard her. The ringing in my ears had returned, deafening and high-pitched. The room seemed to shrink. For a terrifying, agonizing moment, the armor I had built over 15 years cracked. I wasn't a 32-year-old registered nurse. I was 17 again, standing in the living room, listening to my parents completely rewrite reality to justify their cruelty. The sheer audacity of the lie, the profound, staggering evil required to fabricate such a monstrous scenario involving the grandfather I loved more than anything in the world, threatened to crush the breath out of my lungs. I looked at my mother. She was peeking through her fingers, assessing the impact of her performance. Her eyes were completely dry. She wrote it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Jessamine had forged the entry. She had taken one of his blank notebooks, sat down, and meticulously crafted a narrative of pure horror to destroy me. "Miss Dalrymple," Sterling pressed, his voice booming over the ringing in my head, "did you threaten to murder Harrison Dalrymple if he didn't disinherit his own flesh and blood?" I stared at the notebook. I looked closer at the ink. I looked at the loops of the letters, the steady, firm pressure of the pen strokes against the paper. Suddenly, my clinical training kicked in, overriding the panic. I remembered the last 3 weeks of my grandfather's life. I remembered holding his hand as he tried to drink from a straw. I remembered the violent, uncontrollable tremors that had racked his fingers due to his neurological decline. I looked up. I didn't look at Sterling. I looked directly at my mother. "No," I said. My voice wasn't a whisper. It was a clear, ringing bell of absolute certainty. I picked up the notebook and pushed it back across the table toward Arthur Sterling. "For the record," I stated, staring dead into the camera recording the deposition, "this entry is a complete and utter forgery. My grandfather did not write those words." "Ms. Dalrymple, denying the evidence doesn't make it disappear," Sterling scoffed, though his brow furrowed slightly at my sudden shift in demeanor. "We have multiple witnesses who can verify his handwriting." "You have witnesses who can verify what his handwriting looked like 10 years ago, perhaps," I countered, the ice returning to my veins. "But I am a medical professional who provided round-the-clock care for Harrison Dalrymple in his final weeks. On May 14th, the date written on that forged entry, my grandfather was in the advanced stages of Parkinsonian-like tremors, a documented side effect of his vascular decline. He could not hold a glass of water without spilling it. He could not button his own pajamas." I pointed a sharp finger at the open page. "Look at the penmanship, Mr. Sterling. The pressure is perfectly even. The loops on the Y's and the G's are flawless. The baseline is completely straight. A man suffering from terminal motor function loss physically cannot write like that. This was written by someone with a steady hand. Someone who was trying very hard to mimic his signature, but forgot to factor in his physical reality." I shifted my gaze to Jessamine. Her face had suddenly gone a shade of chalky white. The theatrical sobbing had vanished instantly. "I wonder," I said softly, my eyes locking onto my mother's terrified gaze, "whose handwriting an expert forensic analyst will find hidden inside those letters?" Arthur Sterling froze. He looked down at the notebook, his eyes tracing the perfect, steady cursive. He was a ruthless lawyer, but he wasn't a stupid one. He had built his entire strategy on the assumption that this notebook was the smoking gun. He had trusted his clients. Evelyn Vance pounced with the speed and precision of a striking cobra. "Mr. Sterling," Evelyn said, her voice deadly quiet, "we are formally requesting the immediate surrender of Exhibit D for independent forensic handwriting and ink dating analysis. Furthermore, if that analysis concludes, as we fully expect it will, that this document was fabricated by your clients and submitted into discovery, I will not only file for immediate dismissal of this probate challenge with prejudice, but I will refer Oberon and Jessamine Dalrymple to the District Attorney's Office for perjury and the manufacturing of false evidence." Oberon swallowed audibly, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked at his wife. Jessamine was staring at the table, her hands trembling, real tremors this time. Sterling's jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his skin. He looked at my parents, realizing in real time that they had just handed him a ticking time bomb. If he submitted a forged document to the court, his own highly lucrative career could be on the line. "The deposition is suspended," Sterling said abruptly, snapping the file shut. He didn't look at my parents. He looked at Evelyn. "We will review our position regarding Exhibit D. You have 48 hours to hand over the original notebook to our forensic expert, Arthur," Evelyn replied, standing up and buttoning her suit jacket with supreme elegance. "Or I will file a motion to compel, and I will mention the word forgery in the public court record." I stood up, picking up my purse. I didn't say another word to my parents. I didn't need to. The sheer, naked panic radiating from them was the only confirmation I needed. As we walked out of the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut behind us, Evelyn let out a low whistle. "Well," she said, a feral grin spreading across her face, "that was spectacular. They just handed us the rope to hang them with." I leaned against the brass rail of the elevator, closing my eyes, the adrenaline finally beginning to recede, leaving me exhausted but profoundly victorious. "They thought I was just a nurse," I whispered. Evelyn chuckled, pressing the button for the lobby. "Yes, and they forgot that nurses are the ones who actually know how the body dies. They are going to drop that notebook like a hot coal, Corisande, but the damage is done. Sterling knows they're lying now. The trial is going to be a bloodbath." I opened my eyes, looking at my reflection in the elevator doors. The scared, invisible 17-year-old girl was completely gone. In her place stood a woman clad in iron. "Good," I said softly. "Let it bleed." Part 5. The Trial of Truth. The Suffolk County Courthouse is an imposing structure of cold granite and high vaulted ceilings. It is a place designed to make you feel small, to remind you that the law is a heavy, immovable machine. But as I walked up the wide stone steps on the first morning of the trial, flanked by Evelyn Vance, I didn't feel small. I felt like a soldier stepping onto a battlefield I had been preparing for my entire life. The air in the courtroom was stifling, thick with anticipation and the scent of polished wood. Judge Samuel Prescott presided over the bench. He was a man in his late 60s with a reputation for zero tolerance when it came to courtroom theatrics. He did not know me. He had no prior relationship with my family. He was a blank, impartial slate, and that was exactly what Evelyn and I wanted. We didn't need favors. We only needed the truth. At the plaintiff's table, Oberon and Jessamine sat rigidly. My mother was wearing a pale beige suit, looking pale and appropriately fragile. My father sat with his hands steepled, staring a hole into the judge's bench. Noticeably absent from their table was the black moleskin notebook. True to Evelyn's prediction, Arthur Sterling had quietly withdrawn Exhibit D from their evidence list just hours before the forensic deadline. He had refused to submit it to the court. The sudden removal had clearly fractured the relationship between attorney and client. Sterling sat a full foot away from my father, his posture stiff, his jaw clenched. He was a man walking a very dangerous tightrope, bound by his duty to advocate for his clients, but ethically terrified of the perjury he now suspected they were dragging him into. Because the notebook was gone, Sterling's entire case rested on a single, fragile pillar: witness testimony. After the opening statements, where Sterling vaguely painted me as an estranged opportunist and Evelyn cleanly outlined a case of a family throwing a tantrum over an ironclad will, Sterling called his star witness to the stand. "The plaintiffs call Brenda Hayes," Sterling announced. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a woman in her mid-40s walked down the aisle. I recognized her immediately. Brenda was a licensed practical nurse from a private home care agency. During the weeks I had moved in with my grandfather, I had hired Brenda to assist me with his bathing and to sit with him for a few hours on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons so I could sleep. Brenda looked terrified. She was wringing her hands, her eyes darting nervously around the courtroom. She took the oath and sat in the witness box, intentionally avoiding my gaze. "Ms. Hayes," Sterling began, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. "You were employed to assist with the home care of Harrison Dalrymple during his final month, correct?" "Yes, sir," Brenda replied, her voice barely a whisper. "And during that time, who was primarily directing Mr. Dalrymple's care and managing his household?" "Corisande Dalrymple," Brenda said, looking down at her lap. "Can you describe Miss Dalrymple's behavior toward her grandfather, and specifically toward his visitors?" Sterling asked, leading her right into the trap my parents had set. Brenda swallowed hard. She glanced at Jessamine, who was staring at her with wide, expectant eyes. She was very controlling. She kept the curtains drawn. She managed all his medications. Whenever his son, Mr. Oberon Dalrymple, would come to visit, Corisande would tell him his father was too tired to see him. She told me not to let them in if she was sleeping. A low murmur rippled through the small gallery. My father lowered his head, playing the part of the grieving, alienated son. "Did you ever hear Corisande speak to her grandfather about his estate?" Sterling pressed. Brenda's hands shook. I heard her tell him that his son only wanted his money, that if he didn't protect her, she would be left with nothing. "Thank you, Ms. Hayes. No further questions." Sterling retreated to his desk, looking relieved that she had delivered the scripted lines without stuttering. Evelyn stood up. She didn't rush. She buttoned her jacket, picked up a single manila folder, and walked toward the witness stand. "Ms. Hayes," Evelyn said, her voice warm, conversational, and entirely disarming. "You've been a licensed practical nurse for 12 years, is that right?" "Yes, ma'am." "It's a difficult job, long hours, physically demanding, and you're a single mother of 2 teenagers, correct?" Objection, relevance, Sterling snapped. Goes to the witness's background and credibility, Your Honor, Evelyn countered smoothly. Overruled. Keep it brief, Ms. Vance, Judge Prescott warned. I will, Your Honor, Evelyn smiled. She turned back to Brenda. Ms. Hayes, as a nurse, you are mandated to report any signs of elder abuse, coercion, or medical neglect. Did you ever, at any point during your employment, file a report regarding Corisanda Dalrymple's care of her grandfather to Adult Protective Services or the nursing board? Brenda shifted uncomfortably. No, I didn't. Why not? If she was so controlling, so manipulative, why did you stay silent? I was afraid of losing my job, Brenda stammered. Evelyn stopped pacing. She stood directly in front of Brenda. Ms. Hayes, I want you to look at my client. Brenda hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the plaintiff's table, then finally, agonizingly, toward me. I didn't glare at her. I didn't look angry. I looked at her with the deep, profound empathy of a fellow nurse. I saw the dark circles under her eyes, the frayed cuffs of her blouse. I saw a woman who was drowning in stress, cornered by people with far more money and power than she had. I knew exactly what my parents were capable of doing to vulnerable people. Corisanda Dalrymple is a pediatric intensive care nurse, Evelyn said quietly, the courtroom hanging on to her every word. She spent her entire savings to hire you so her grandfather wouldn't have to go into a sterile facility. She worked alongside you. Did she ever raise her voice to him? Did she ever withhold his medication? No, Brenda whispered, tears springing to her eyes. Evelyn opened the manila folder. Miss Hayes, 3 weeks ago, you made a cash deposit of $25,000 into your personal checking account. This deposit occurred 2 days after you were served with a subpoena to testify in this trial by the plaintiffs. Sterling jumped out of his chair. Objection, Your Honor, this is outrageous. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, Judge Prescott barked, leaning forward, his eyes suddenly piercing. I will hear this. Proceed, Ms. Vance. Evelyn pulled out a bank statement obtained through an emergency subpoena. $25,000, Brenda, from an anonymous cashier's check. My client's mother, Jessamine Dalrymple, drives a silver Mercedes SUV. The surveillance cameras at the Bank of America branch in your neighborhood show a woman matching her exact description handing you a thick envelope in the parking lot on that exact date. The courtroom erupted into a collective gasp. Jessamine let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Oberon grabbed her arm, his face turning an ashen gray. Brenda, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a gentle, urging tone. Perjury is a felony. It carries a prison sentence. You have children. Do not go to prison for a woman who will forget your name the moment she walks out of this room. Who gave you that money? Brenda broke. She covered her face with her hands, and a loud, racking sob tore through the silent courtroom. She did! Brenda cried, pointing a trembling finger directly at Jessamine. She cornered me outside my house. She told me if I didn't testify that Corisande isolated him, she would report me to the state board for stealing narcotics. She said she would ruin my life. I needed the money for my son's tuition. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Total chaos broke out. Jessamine shot to her feet. She's lying. She's a lying trailer trash thief. Order! Judge Prescott roared, slamming his gavel down with the force of a thunderclap. Mrs. Dalrymple, you will sit down and close your mouth immediately, or you will be spending the night in a holding cell. My mother collapsed back into her chair, shaking uncontrollably. Arthur Sterling was staring at the table, his face completely devoid of color. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on the tracks with a freight train bearing down on him. Ms. Hayes, Judge Prescott said, his voice terrifyingly calm. I am striking your direct testimony from the record. You are excused from the stand, and I suggest you retain criminal counsel immediately. Brenda fled the courtroom, weeping. Evelyn walked back to our table and sat down. She didn't look triumphant. She looked clinical, like a surgeon who had just made the first critical incision. Does the plaintiff have any further witnesses? Judge Prescott asked, glaring at Arthur Sterling. Sterling stood up slowly. No, Your Honor. The plaintiff's rest. Very well. Ms. Vance, you may call your first witness. Evelyn stood. The defense calls Dr. Julian Croft. A tall, distinguished man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses walked through the doors. He carried a heavy, locked steel briefcase. He took the stand and introduced himself as a senior partner at a prominent psychiatric evaluation firm, specializing in geriatric cognitive capability and estate planning competency. "Dr. Croft," Evelyn began, "what was your relationship with Harrison Dalrymple?" "Mr. Dalrymple retained my firm's services exactly 1 year prior to his passing," Dr. Croft explained in a crisp academic tone. "He was a very pragmatic man. He informed me that he intended to drastically alter his will, completely disinheriting his son in favor of his granddaughter. He explicitly stated that he anticipated a vicious, bad faith legal challenge from his son, Oberon." Oberon flinched as if he had been struck. "And what did Mr. Dalrymple ask you to do?" Evelyn asked. "He asked us to build a fortress," Dr. Croft said simply. He placed the steel briefcase on the ledge of the witness stand and unlocked it with a sharp click. "For the last 12 months of his life, I conducted a full recorded cognitive assessment of Mr. Dalrymple every 30 days. We documented his memory, his reasoning, and his testamentary capacity. He scored in the 99th percentile for his age bracket right up until the final weeks of his life. He was not manipulated. He was entirely, acutely aware of his actions." "Did he provide any reasoning for his decision?" "He did, in abundance." Dr. Croft reached into the briefcase and pulled out a digital audio recorder. "Mr. Dalrymple forwarded us copies of every voicemail his son left him over the past 3 years to be kept in our secure evidentiary vault to establish the true nature of their relationship." Evelyn looked at the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to submit Defense Exhibit A into evidence and play a selection for the court. These are voicemails left by the plaintiff, Oberon Dalrymple, on the decedent's answering machine, which were lawfully recorded under standard telecommunications protocols." "Objection!" Sterling practically yelled, though there was no heat in his voice, only panic. "Hearsay, and prejudicial." "They are statements by a party opponent, Your Honor," Evelyn countered instantly, "and they go directly to the plaintiff's motive and the decedent's state of mind." "Overruled! Play the audio," Judge Prescott commanded. Evelyn connected the recorder to the courtroom's audio system. She pressed play. A sharp beep echoed through the room, followed by the unmistakable, arrogant baritone of my father. "Dad, pick up the phone. It's Oberon. Listen, Nathaniel's investors are threatening to file a lawsuit. The kid made a mistake. All right, I need you to wire $200,000 to my account by tomorrow morning. Don't give me that lecture about responsibility again. You have millions sitting around doing nothing. If you don't help us out, Jessamine is going to have a breakdown and we won't be coming to Thanksgiving. Wire the money, Dad." A second beep. "Dad, it's me again. The country club dues are up and the market took a hit. I need an advance on my inheritance. Just 50 grand. Call my accountant. And tell that little brat, Corisande, to stop leaving her cheap nursing textbooks in your living room. It makes the place look like a public library." A third beep. This one was different. My father's voice was slurred, angry, and vicious. "You selfish old man. You think you can just cut me off? I am your son. You owe me that house. You owe me that money. You're going to die alone in that house. You hear me? The only reason we even pretend to care is because we're waiting for you to drop dead so we can finally get what we deserve." The audio cut to a hiss of static and then silence. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. I looked at my father. He had shrunk in his chair. The broad shoulders, the tailored suit, the arrogant posture, it was all gone. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely broken. The mask had been ripped off in front of the judge, the court reporter, and the public gallery. He was exposed as a greedy, abusive parasite who had terrorized an old man for his money. Dr. Croft looked at Oberon with undisguised disgust. Mr. Dalrymple made it very clear on the record that he was disinheriting his son because of a lifetime of financial abuse and emotional neglect. He left his estate to his granddaughter, Corisande, because, in his own words, "She is the only one who visits me when she doesn't need a check." Evelyn turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Prescott looked at Arthur Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, do you wish to cross-examine this witness?" Arthur Sterling stood up. He didn't look at Dr. Croft. He didn't look at Evelyn. He looked down at the massive pile of documents on his table. He stood in silence for 5 agonizing seconds. Then he began packing his briefcase. He moved methodically, snapping his files shut, sliding his pens into his leather folio. Oberon stared at him, bewildered. "Arthur, what are you doing?" Oberon hissed, loud enough for the microphone to pick up. "Cross-examine him. Object to something." Sterling ignored him. He zipped his briefcase shut, picked it up, and walked around the table to stand directly in front of the judge's bench. "Your Honor?" Sterling said, his voice remarkably steady, though his face was a mask of furious humiliation. At this time, pursuant to the Massachusetts Rules of Professional Conduct, specifically Rule 3.3 regarding candor toward the tribunal and Rule 1.16 regarding declining or terminating representation, I must formally request the court's permission to immediately withdraw as counsel for the plaintiffs, Oberon and Jessamine Dalrymple. The entire courtroom inhaled sharply. An attorney withdrawing mid-trial was the legal equivalent of detonating a nuclear bomb on his own clients. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Prescott said, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing, "are you stating that you can no longer ethically represent these clients?" "I am stating, Your Honor, that it has become abundantly clear during today's proceedings that I cannot continue this representation without violating my ethical obligations as an officer of this court. I have been compromised." "You coward!" The scream tore out of Jessamine's throat like a physical weapon. She leapt from her chair, her face contorted into a mask of absolute unhinged fury. The carefully constructed socialite facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "You took our money!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Sterling. "You said you could break that little bitch. You promised me we would get the house." "Mrs. Dalrymple!" the judge roared, banging his gavel. But Jessamine was too far gone. The narcissistic collapse was total and violent. She spun around, her eyes locking onto me. They were wide, wild, and filled with a lifetime of venom. "You did this!" she screamed, her voice cracking, echoing off the stone walls. "You ruined everything. You were a mistake. I never wanted you. I should have gotten rid of you when I had the chance. You think you're so high and mighty sitting there in your cheap little suit playing the saint? You're nothing. You'll always be nothing. That house is mine. The money is mine." She lunged toward the center aisle, her hands outstretched like claws. 2 court bailiffs immediately intercepted her, grabbing her arms. She fought them, kicking and thrashing, her expensive heels slipping on the polished floor, screaming profanities that made the court reporter physically flinch. Oberon sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly ahead, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic destruction of his life. "Get her out of my courtroom!" Judge Prescott shouted over her screaming. "Bailiffs, remove her and place her in a holding cell for contempt of court." And as they dragged my mother backward through the heavy wooden doors, her screams echoing down the marble hallway, I sat perfectly still. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel fear. I felt a profound, overwhelming wave of pity. This was the monster that had haunted my childhood. This screaming, desperate, pathetic woman was the source of all my nightmares. And now, exposed to the light of truth, she wasn't terrifying at all. She was just deeply, irreparably broken. The heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off her screams. The courtroom descended into a stunned, ringing silence. Judge Prescott took a deep breath, adjusting his robes. He looked at Arthur Sterling, who was still standing at the podium. "Mr. Sterling, your motion to withdraw is granted. You are excused." Sterling nodded curtly, turned on his heel, and walked out of the courtroom without a single backward glance at Oberon. The judge then turned his attention to my father, who was still sitting alone at the plaintiff's table, looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man. "Mr. Dalrymple," Judge Prescott said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely witnessed such a staggering display of greed, perjury, and bad faith litigation. You and your wife attempted to subvert the legal system, bribe witnesses, and destroy the professional reputation of a registered nurse simply because you were too arrogant to accept that your father saw you for exactly what you are." Oberon didn't answer. He just stared at the table. "This court finds the last will and testament of Harrison Dalrymple to be completely valid, executed with full testamentary capacity, and devoid of any undue influence," Judge Prescott declared, his voice ringing with finality. "The plaintiff's challenge to the estate is hereby dismissed with prejudice. You may not refeel." He picked up his gavel, but paused. "Furthermore," the judge added, his eyes narrowing, "due to the egregious nature of the plaintiff's conduct, the introduction of fabricated testimony, and the sheer frivolity of this action, I am ordering the plaintiffs, Oberon and Jessamine Dalrymple, to pay the entirety of the defendant's legal fees. I am also directing the court clerk to forward the transcripts of today's proceedings to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges regarding witness tampering and perjury." He raised the wooden gavel high. "This case is closed." Bang! The sound echoed through my chest, breaking the last invisible chain that tied me to that family. Evelyn let out a long, slow breath and turned to me. She didn't smile. She simply reached out and placed her hand over mine. "It's over, Corisanda," she said quietly. "You won." I stood up. I looked across the room at Oberon Dalrymple. He didn't look up at me. He was completely destroyed, trapped in a nightmare of his own making, facing bankruptcy, public humiliation, and potential criminal charges. I didn't gloat. I didn't say a word. I simply picked up my purse, turned my back on him, and walked down the center aisle. When I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the hallway, the afternoon sunlight was streaming through the high arched windows, casting long golden beams across the marble floor. I took a deep breath. The air tasted clean. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cool metal of the daisy pin. I stood my ground, Grandpa. I thought, a quiet, peaceful tear slipping down my cheek. I stood my ground. Winning a war does not feel like the movies tell you it will. There is no swelling orchestral music, no sudden, magical erasure of the scars you've accumulated. When you step off a battlefield that you have been fighting on since you were a child, the first thing you feel is not joy. It is a profound, echoing exhaustion. In the days following the catastrophic collapse of my parents' legal challenge, the silence in my life was deafening. The frantic, adrenaline-fueled pacing of the last few months had vanished. There were no more depositions to prepare for, no more malicious articles planted in the local blogs, and no more looming threats to my nursing license. Judge Prescott had been true to his word. The transcripts of the trial, specifically the section detailing Jessamyn's attempt to bribe Brenda Hayes, were handed over to the district attorney's office. My parents were no longer just fighting a civil probate loss. They were fighting criminal perjury and witness tampering charges. But it wasn't until 3 weeks after the trial ended that I finally understood why. I was sitting in Evelyn Vance's office, signing the final stacks of paperwork to officially transfer the Oak Ridge estate and the $18.5 million into my name. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across her mahogany desk. Evelyn closed a thick financial ledger and leaned back in her chair, studying me over the rim of her glasses. "I had my forensic accountants do a deep dive into your parents' assets, Corisande," Evelyn said quietly, her tone uncharacteristically subdued. "To ensure we could collect the legal fees the judge ordered them to pay, we had to pierce their corporate veils to find the money." I stopped signing. "And?" "There is no money," Evelyn replied, shaking her head in a mixture of disbelief and professional disgust. "Corisande, they are completely, catastrophically bankrupt." I stared at her, trying to process the words. "That's impossible. My father has an investment firm. My mother throws $50,000 charity galas." "It was a house of cards," Evelyn explained, sliding a summary sheet across the desk. "Oberon's firm hasn't turned a legitimate profit in 8 years. He has been taking out massive, high-interest loans just to maintain their country club memberships and lease their luxury cars. And Nathaniel," she sighed heavily, "Nathaniel didn't just have a few failed startups. He has millions of dollars in the hole to private, unregulated lenders. Your parents drained their entire retirement, maxed out every line of credit, and leveraged everything they had to keep Nathaniel out of federal prison for wire fraud." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped together, forming a horrifying picture. "The Oak Ridge estate," I whispered, the breath leaving my lungs. "Exactly," Evelyn nodded. "The only reason they weren't foreclosed on and living on the street was because your grandfather owned that mansion outright and paid the property taxes. It was their last remaining shield. If they had inherited the $18 million, they could have paid off Nathaniel's debts, covered their own tracks, and kept the illusion alive. When Harrison left it all to you, he didn't just disinherit them. He pulled the sheet off the ghost." It all made sense now. The sheer, feral desperation, the willingness to forge documents, to bribe a home care nurse, to try and destroy my career. They weren't just fighting out of greed, they were fighting for their survival. Without their wealth, without their elite social status, Oberon and Jessamyn Dalrymple were nothing. They had built their entire identities around a lie, and I was the one holding the match that burned it down. "What happens to them now?" I asked, looking down at my hands. "The bank is calling in Oberon's loans," Evelyn said clinically. "The criminal charges against your mother will likely result in a plea deal for heavy probation, given she's a first-time offender, but the legal fees to defend herself will bankrupt them completely. Nathaniel has already fled the state. We can serve them with a 30-day eviction notice for the Oak Ridge property tomorrow." I looked out the window at the Boston skyline. For 17 years, I had dreamed of the day my parents would face the consequences of their cruelty. I had imagined the satisfaction of watching them lose everything. But sitting there, holding the power of their absolute destruction in my hands, I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt incredibly sad. They had traded their souls, their daughter, and their dignity for a facade that was currently crumbling into dust. "No," I said quietly. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "I don't want to evict them onto the street, Evelyn. If I do that, I'm acting out of vengeance. I'm letting their darkness infect me." I picked up the pen and twirled it between my fingers. "Sell the Oak Ridge estate. The market is hot. We can get at least $8 million for it. But before the cash settles into my accounts, take $300,000. Evelyn leaned forward, intrigued. "And do what with it?" "Buy a small 2-bedroom condo in a blue-collar neighborhood. Something safe, but completely unremarkable. No doormen, no marble foyers," I instructed, my voice firm and clear. "Put the deed in an irrevocable trust. Allow Oberon and Jessamine to live there rent-free for the rest of their lives. But stipulate that they cannot sell it, they cannot borrow against it, and Nathaniel is never allowed to be listed as a resident." Evelyn smiled slowly, a look of profound respect dawning in her eyes. "A golden cage," she murmured, "or rather, a very plain linoleum-floored cage. You're giving them a roof over their heads, which means they can never claim you left them to die. You clear your conscience. But you are forcing them to live a normal, average life, stripped of all their pretenses." "It's my final payment," I said softly. "They gave me life, even if they didn't want to nurture it. This pays that debt. Once the keys are handed over, I am legally and morally severing all ties. I never want to see or hear from them again." Evelyn nodded, making a note on her legal pad. "It will be done by the end of the month." And it was. The Oak Ridge estate was sold to a tech billionaire. Oberon and Jessamine moved into a modest ground-floor condo in a quiet suburb. I was told by the trust manager that my mother wept uncontrollably when she saw the laminate countertops, and my father simply sat in a cheap armchair, staring at the blank wall. They were safe, they were housed, but their masquerade was over. They had to face the reality of who they were, and they had to face it alone. As for me, I finally had the freedom to build the life I had always deserved. I didn't quit my job. The idea of sitting around a luxury penthouse sipping champagne sounded like a prison sentence to me. Nursing wasn't just my paycheck, it was my calling. It was the place where my empathy had value. I took a portion of the inheritance and bought a beautiful, historic, craftsman-style house in a neighborhood lined with ancient oak trees. It had a wraparound porch, a big kitchen bathed in morning light, and a backyard where I immediately started planting a garden, just like the one Grandpa Harrison used to have. But the majority of the $18.5 million did not go into my personal bank accounts. 6 months after the trial ended, I stood in the administrative boardroom of the pediatric hospital where I worked. Beside me stood the chief of medicine and the hospital's financial director. "On behalf of the Dalrymple estate," I said, sliding a thick portfolio across the table, "I would like to formally establish the Harrison Dalrymple Pediatric Surgical Fund. I am endowing it with $10 million. The hospital director's jaw literally dropped. "The criteria are simple," I continued, feeling a radiant, overwhelming warmth spreading through my chest. "This fund is specifically designed to cover the total out-of-pocket costs for life-saving surgeries for uninsured or underinsured pediatric patients. No child should be denied care because their parents can't afford it, and no parent should have to go bankrupt to save their child. Grandpa Harrison believed that wealth was only valuable if it was used to protect the vulnerable. This is his legacy." When the news of the endowment broke within the hospital, the reaction was overwhelming. The nurses who had whispered about me during the smear campaign came to me with tears in their eyes, apologizing for ever doubting my character. But I didn't hold their initial doubts against them. I knew how convincing my parents could be. A year has passed since the judge struck his gavel. My life is incredibly quiet now, and I guard that peace fiercely. I still work my 12-hour shifts in the PICU. I still hold the hands of frightened parents. But when I clock out, I don't go back to a drafty basement apartment, and I don't carry the crushing weight of my parents' disapproval on my shoulders. I go home to my craftsman house. I make a cup of Earl Grey tea. I sit on my front porch, listening to the wind rustle through the oak trees, and I watch the sunset. Sometimes I think about Oberon and Jessamine. I wonder if they ever look around their small, quiet condo and realize the magnitude of what they threw away. I wonder if they realize that the daughter they treated like a burden would have gladly taken care of them in their old age if they had simply shown her an ounce of genuine love. But I don't dwell on it. Their darkness is no longer my burden to carry. Family is not defined by blood. Blood only dictates biology. True family is defined by loyalty, by safety, and by the people who choose to stand in the storm with you. My grandfather was my family. The friends who supported me during the trial are my family. The little patients I care for every day are my family. I survived the fire, and I didn't let it turn me into ash. I let it forge me into iron. If there is one thing I hope you take away from my story, it is this. Do not let broken people convince you that you are hard to love. Do not let toxic family members use your empathy as a weapon against you. You have the right to walk away from anyone who requires you to shrink yourself to keep them comfortable. Your peace is sacred. Protect it at all costs. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Sharing this hasn't been easy, but if my story can give even one person the courage to stand up to their own toxic family dynamics, then every tear was worth it. If you found value in this story, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. We are building a community here of people who refuse to be defined by the trauma of their past, and I would love for you to be a part of it. Leave a comment below and tell me your thoughts. I read every single one. Until next time, stay strong, protect your peace, and take care of yourselves.